People like you don't belong in first class. The words sliced through the cabin of Atlantic Airways Flight 847 like a blade through silk. Isabella Hartwell stood in the aisle, her diamond-encrusted finger pointing directly at the black man sitting quietly in seat 1A. She had no idea that in exactly 16 minutes the engines would fail, and she had no clue that the man she was insulting would be the only person on board capable of saving her life. In 18 minutes she'd be in handcuffs. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we dive into this story of sky-high karma and justice served at 30,000 feet, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe that respect should be universal, hit that subscribe button and share this video. Now let's rewind to 30 minutes earlier, when this collision course with destiny began. Dr. Cameron Blake shuffled down the jet bridge at JFK International Airport, his weathered Harvard hoodie pulled up against the October chill. At 40 years old, Cameron looked older than his years. The past 72 hours had been a blur of emergency meetings at the Pentagon, classified briefings, and high-pressure consultations that had left him exhausted. His noise-canceling headphones hung around his neck like a lifeline, and he carried a technical manual so worn the cover had separated from the binding. Cameron wasn't your typical first-class passenger. No Armani suit, no Italian leather briefcase, no assistant trailing behind him. He looked like any grad student heading home after a long semester. But appearances, as this story will prove, can be devastatingly deceiving. He found his seat, one a window side, and settled in with the relief of a man who had paid full fare specifically for 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep. Cameron had been awake for 38 hours straight, and the technical manual in his lap contained solutions to problems that kept generals awake at night. But as far as anyone on Flight 847 could tell, he was just another tired passenger in a hoodie. 20 rows behind him, the gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom. "We're now boarding our VIP passengers." That announcement was Isabella Hartwell's cue to make her entrance. Isabella swept through the jet bridge like she owned it, which in her mind she practically did. At 38, she had the kind of wealth that bought perfect faces and perfect bodies, though no amount of money could purchase the one thing she lacked: a decent soul. Her cream-colored cashmere coat cost more than most people's cars. Her Cartier jewelry caught the cabin lights like tiny spotlights announcing her arrival. Behind her, the flight attendants were already walking on eggshells. The manifest didn't just list her name, it flashed warnings in red. V.I. P. Wife of Derek Hartwell, CEO of Meridian Industries. Handle with extreme care. This notation meant one thing: Isabella Hartwell was dangerous to ignore, and even more dangerous to cross. She had been flying first class since childhood, had been called ma'am since she could walk, and had never, not once, in her privileged life been told the word no. Today would not be the day that changed. Isabella entered the first-class cabin and stopped dead. Her usual seat won. The window seat that she demanded on every flight was occupied. By him. The man in the hoodie who clearly didn't belong. The cabin fell silent. 8 first-class seats, 7 of them filled with the usual suspects: investment bankers, tech entrepreneurs, pharmaceutical executives. All white, all wealthy, all watching to see what Isabella would do about this obvious mistake. In seat 2, sat Miguel Santos, a 32-year-old tech entrepreneur whose company had just gone public for $8 billion. Miguel wore a faded t-shirt that probably cost more than Isabella's shoes, though she didn't know that. He looked up from his tablet, immediately sensing trouble. Rosa Martinez, the lead flight attendant, approached with 20 years of experience managing difficult passengers. She had seen every type of entitled traveler, but something about Isabella's energy set her on edge. "Excuse me," Isabella snapped, not bothering to turn toward Rosa. "My seat is 1A. "Why is there someone in it?" Rosa forced a smile. "Let me check that for you, Mrs. Hartwell." It's Miss Hartwell, Isabella corrected sharply. And don't check, just move him. Cameron looked up from his technical manual. His eyes were calm, dark, and deep, showing no surprise, only a weary patience born from experiencing this exact situation too many times before. He had heard the tone seen. The pointing finger felt the weight of assumptions crashing down on him like a familiar, unwelcome storm. Sir Rosa said gently, "May I see your boarding pass?" Cameron reached into his hoodie pocket and produced a crisp, first-class ticket. Seat 1. "Ah," he said quietly, his voice a rich baritone that carried both dignity and exhaustion. Paid in full. Isabella's face twisted into something ugly. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. People like him were supposed to apologize, gather their belongings, and shuffle back to economy where they belonged. They weren't supposed to have paperwork. "There's obviously been a mistake," Isabella declared, her voice rising loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "This is first class. Economy is back there past the curtain. You probably got confused by the boarding numbers." Cameron marked his page in the technical manual and looked directly at Isabella for the first time. "Ma'am, I'm in seat 1A. My ticket says 1A. I believe this is the correct spot." Isabella laughed a sharp barking sound that contained no humor whatsoever. "Don't play games with me. I know exactly how this works. You used miles, or you're an employee flying standby, or you're just lost. My husband, Derek Hartwell, practically owns every route this airline flies. I always sit in 1A. It's my seat. So pack up your little backpack and move." The temperature in the cabin dropped 10 degrees. Miguel Santos lowered his tablet, completely no longer pretending to work. The banker in 3B stopped shuffling his papers. This was the uncomfortable theater of public wealth and racism, and Isabella was putting on a show for an audience that hadn't asked to watch. Rosa rushed over, her face pale. "Miss Hartwell, please. Dr. Blake is a ticketed passenger in seat 1A. Your seat is 1B right next to him. It's the same configuration, just the aisle side." Isabella spun on Rosa, her eyes wide with indignation. 1B, I specifically requested the window seat. And I certainly didn't request to sit next to. She gestured vaguely at Cameron, her hand waving dismissively at his hoodie. "Next to someone who looks like he robs convenience stores." A gasp rippled through the small cabin. The words hung in the air like poison gas, impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. Cameron didn't flinch. He had heard worse from better people in more important rooms. Instead, he looked at Isabella with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a volatile chemical reaction. He had spent his career solving complex problems under pressure. This woman was just another variable in an equation he had solved many times before. "Ma'am," Cameron said softly, "I paid for this seat. I'm tired. I intend to stay here. If you have an issue with the seating chart, I suggest you take it up with the gate agent. But the door is closing." Isabella's face flushed red. In her world, quiet dignity was interpreted as defiance, and defiance was unacceptable. "Don't you speak to me," she hissed, slamming her Hermes bag onto seat 1B with enough force to rattle the overhead compartments. "You have no idea who I am. You think because you scraped together enough points for an upgrade you belong here? You don't. You lower the property value just by sitting there." Miss Hartwell Rosa intervened, her voice firmer now. "The door is closed. We are pushing back. You need to sit down and buckle your seatbelt, or we will have to return to the gate and have you escorted off." The threat hung in the air like a sword over Isabella's head. Returning to the gate meant delays, missed connections, and most importantly, it meant missing the charity gala in London where she was scheduled to be photographed for Vanity Fair. Isabella weighed her options with the cold calculation of a general planning a war. She glared at Rosa, then at Cameron, then back at Rosa. "Fine," she spat, "but I am filing a formal complaint against this airline, and against you. She pointed at Cameron like she was identifying a criminal in a lineup the moment we land. "You better enjoy the champagne, honey. It's the last time you'll taste anything this good." Isabella dropped into seat 1B and buckled her seatbelt with violent jerks, each click a small act of aggression. Cameron simply put his headphones back on, closed his eyes, and turned his face toward the window. He didn't know it yet, but the woman beside him wasn't just a nuisance. She was a lit match sitting next to a powder keg at 30,000 feet. Flight 847 pushed back from the gate at exactly 8:47 p.m., 17 minutes behind schedule. The Boeing 777 taxied through the maze of runway lights at JFK, its twin engines humming with the power of 115,000 pounds of thrust each. In 45 minutes, one of those engines would explode, and the lives of 298 passengers would depend entirely on the man Isabella had just called a thug. But first, she had work to do. The first hour of the flight was deceptively calm. The massive aircraft climbed smoothly through 35,000 feet, floating above a blanket of October clouds that stretched from New York to Newfoundland. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and the cabin settled into the familiar rhythm of a long-haul flight. Isabella ordered her first vodka tonic before the wheels had even retracted. By the time they reached cruising altitude, she was on her third. The alcohol mixed with her existing rage like gasoline meeting a spark, creating a toxic cocktail of entitlement and liquid courage that made her more dangerous with every sip. While Cameron dozed, or pretended to doze to avoid interaction, Isabella pulled out her phone. Though there was no cellular service over the Atlantic, she connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi and began furiously typing messages to her husband's assistant. "Get me the name of the airline CEO immediately. I am sitting next to a thug. This is unacceptable. I want him blacklisted from every carrier Derek's company works with. Make it happen." She glanced over at Cameron every few minutes, her disgust growing with each look. He had shifted in his sleep, his arm slightly crossing the invisible boundary of the center armrest. To Isabella, this was tantamount to an invasion of her sovereign territory. "Get your arm off my side," she shrieked loud enough to wake half the cabin. Cameron jerked awake, disoriented. "What? You touched me," Isabella accused, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch that could cut glass. "You were reaching for my bag." "I was asleep," Cameron said, rubbing his eyes. "I didn't touch your bag." "Liar." Isabella stood up, swaying slightly from the vodka. The cabin was dim, most passengers trying to rest, but now everyone was awake and staring. "He's trying to rob me, Rosa." Rosa Martinez, came running from the galley, followed by Kevin Thompson, a junior flight attendant who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Rosa had dealt with difficult passengers before, but Isabella was operating on a level of entitlement that transcended normal human behavior. "What is the problem now, Miss Hartwell?" Rosa asked her patience, visibly fraying like a rope under too much weight. "He tried to steal my wallet." Isabella pointed a shaking finger at Cameron like she was identifying a suspect in a police lineup. "I saw him. He waited until I looked away and reached for my purse." Cameron unbuckled his seatbelt and sat up straighter. The casual demeanor was gone, replaced by a steely dignity that seemed to radiate from his core. This was a man who had briefed senators, who had been consulted by generals, who had solved problems that kept entire governments awake at night. He would not be reduced to this. "That is a lie," Cameron said, his voice cold and precise. "I haven't moved from this seat." Isabella leaned down until her face was inches from his, her breath reeking of vodka and venom. Who were they going to believe, she sneered, speaking just loud enough for him to hear? "Me, the wife of Derek Hartwell, or you? Look at yourself. You look like you just came from a street corner." Miguel Santos in seat 2. A had been watching this entire exchange with growing disgust. As the founder of 3 successful tech companies and a man worth approximately $8 billion, Miguel understood power dynamics better than most. What he was witnessing wasn't just racism. It was the weaponization of privilege, and it made him sick. "She's lying," Miguel said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. He removed his glasses and looked directly at Rosa. "The guy hasn't moved a muscle since takeoff. She, however, has been drinking vodka like it's water and muttering racial slurs under her breath for the last hour." Isabella spun around to face Miguel, her face twisted into a mask of rage and disbelief. "You shut up. You're probably in on it." "What is this, some kind of gang?" Miss Hartwell, Rosa said, stepping forward with her authority fully engaged now. "Sit down immediately. One more outburst and I will have the captain lock down this cabin and we will have authorities waiting at Heathrow." "You threaten me?" Isabella laughed, a high, manic sound that belonged in an asylum. "My husband pays your salary. I will have your job. I will have you begging on the street by Christmas." But she sat down. The threat of missing her Vanity Fair photo opportunity was stronger than her need to continue the assault. However, sitting down didn't mean she was finished. For Isabella Hartwell, this was just the end of round 1. For the next 2 hours, it became a campaign of psychological warfare. Isabella kicked the partition between their seats every few minutes. She accidentally spilled her drink toward Cameron's belongings. She mumbled insults just loud enough to be heard, but quiet enough to be deniable affirmative action hire. "Doesn't belong here. Probably selling drugs in the bathroom." Cameron sat like a stone statue, absorbing every attack with the patience of a man who had learned that dignity was the only weapon that mattered in battles like this. But he was also doing something Isabella couldn't see. He had taken out a small notepad and was methodically documenting everything she said, noting the time, the witnesses, and the exact words. Cameron Blake was an engineer, and engineers solved problems with data. In a battle of he said, she said, documentation was the only weapon that mattered. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, somewhere over the dark, freezing waters of the North Atlantic, Isabella stood up again. The vodka had worn off enough for her to think clearly, but not enough to think wisely. She rummaged through her Hermes bag, frantically dumping contents onto her seat: lipstick, phone, passport, breath mints, credit cards. "It's gone," she whispered. Then louder, "It's gone!" Rosa appeared instantly, her internal alarm bells ringing. A missing item at 35,000 feet was always a crisis waiting to happen. "What's gone, Miss Hartwell?" "My bracelet. My diamond tennis bracelet. It's vintage Cartier worth $50,000. Isabella's voice was climbing toward hysteria with each word. "He has it." She spun around and pointed directly at Cameron's chest. "He took it while I was in the bathroom. Search him. Strip search him right now." Cameron closed his technical manual slowly, the sound of pages meeting like a judge's gavel. The patience was gone from his eyes, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "I have not touched your jewelry," Cameron said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "And you will not search me." "He has it in his pocket," Isabella shrieked. "I saw him put it there. Check the cameras if you have them," Cameron said to Rosa, never taking his eyes off Isabella. "Or ask the gentleman across the aisle. He's been awake the whole time." Miguel nodded from his seat. "She's been falling down drunk for hours. The bracelet probably fell when she was stumbling around earlier. That's when Isabella made her fatal mistake. Fueled by 4 vodka tonics and a lifetime of unchecked privilege, she threw herself across the center console and lunged at Cameron's hoodie pocket. "Get off me!" Cameron shouted instinctively, pushing her back. He used only enough force to separate them, but Isabella, drunk and unsteady, threw herself backward dramatically and crashed into the aisle. "Assault!" she screamed from the floor, sprawling like a broken doll. "He hit me! He attacked me! Help!" The cabin erupted into chaos. Rosa and Kevin rushed to lift Isabella, who had gone completely limp, sobbing and screaming about her stolen diamonds. Other passengers were sitting up some recording on their phones, others demanding to know what was happening. That's when Captain Jennifer Walsh's voice crackled over the intercom, tight and urgent cabin crew to stations, immediately. But Captain Walsh wasn't calling stations because of Isabella's theatrics. At that exact moment, 35,000 feet above the North Atlantic, something catastrophic was happening to engine number 1. The plane lurched. Not the gentle bump of turbulence, but a violent stomach-dropping sensation of gravity disappearing. The massive Boeing 777 didn't just shake, it convulsed like a giant beast in its death throes. Then came the sound. Every passenger would remember it for the rest of their lives, a thunderous metallic bang that vibrated through the floor, the seats, and straight into their bones. Engine number 1 had just suffered what engineers call catastrophic containment failure, a polite term for explosion. The lights flickered once, twice, then died, replaced by the dim red glow of emergency lighting. In the space of 3 seconds, Atlantic Airways Flight 847 had transformed from a luxury airliner into a flying coffin. Isabella stopped screaming instantly. She sat on the cabin floor looking up at Cameron with eyes wide with terror. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind rushing past the wounded aircraft. "What did you do to the plane?" Cameron wasn't listening to her. He was listening to something else, the absence of sound that was more terrifying than any noise. At 35,000 feet, you never want to hear silence. You want the roar, the constant white noise that tells you the massive turbines are churning air and keeping you alive. But the roar on the left side of the aircraft had been replaced by a grinding metallic screech, followed by the horrifying sound of a dead engine windmilling in the slipstream. In the cockpit, Captain Jennifer Walsh was fighting for control of an aircraft that was trying to kill her. Mayday. 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 Atlantic Airways, 847. We have catastrophic failure in Engine 1. Multiple hydraulic systems failing. We are losing altitude. The luxury was gone from the first-class cabin. Champagne glasses lay shattered on the floor. The steep angle of the emergency descent made it hard to breathe, and though oxygen masks hadn't deployed yet, the cabin pressure was dropping fast enough to make everyone's ears pop painfully. Isabella was still on the floor now, clutching the leg of Cameron's seat like a drowning person gripping driftwood. The bravado had evaporated, leaving behind a trembling child. "Are we going to crash?" she whimpered. "We're going to die, aren't we?" Cameron. Blake didn't answer her. He was looking out the window, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He wasn't praying, wasn't panicking. He was analyzing. He watched the way the wing's ailerons were fluttering against the airstream. He felt the specific vibration pattern traveling through the aircraft's frame. "Hydraulic bleed," Cameron muttered to himself, his engineering mind automatically shifting into diagnostic mode. "The bypass valve is stuck open. They're losing pressure in the primary loop." "What?" Isabella stared at him with confusion and growing terror. "What are you talking about?" "Be quiet," Cameron commanded. It wasn't an insult or a dismissal. It was an operational directive from a man whose mind was processing data that could save 298 lives. Rosa crawled up the aisle, holding on to seat backs for balance as the aircraft continued its steep emergency descent. "Ladies and gentlemen, please heads down, stay calm. The captain is performing an emergency descent." "I don't want to die," Isabella screamed, grabbing Rosa's ankle with both hands. "My husband will sue you if I die." "Let go of her," Cameron barked, reaching down and carefully but firmly removing Isabella's fingers from Rosa's leg. "She has a job to do. Sit in your seat and strap in or you'll break your neck when we hit turbulence." For the first time in her life, Isabella Hartwell obeyed an order without question. She scrambled into seat 1B and fumbled with the seatbelt buckle, but her hands were shaking so violently she couldn't make it work. Cameron saw her struggling. Despite the racist slurs, despite the false accusations, despite the physical assault, he reached over. His calm, steady hands clicked her seatbelt into place and pulled the strap tight across her lap. "Breathe," he told her quietly. "Hyperventilating uses more oxygen. You need to stay conscious." Isabella stared at him through her tears, mascara streaming down her face in black rivers. "Why are you helping me?" "Because I'm a human being," Cameron said, turning back toward the window. That's when the intercom crackled to life again. Captain Walsh's voice filled the cabin, strained and lacking the usual pilot's professional calm. "This is the captain. Is there an engineer on board? Specifically anyone with experience in avionics or GE-90 turbine systems? We have a sensor disagreement that is locking us out of the restart sequence. If anyone has technical knowledge, please identify yourself to the crew immediately." It was a Hail Mary pass a desperate plea from a pilot who was rapidly running out of options. Pilots are trained to fly airplanes, but when the computer brain of the aircraft begins hallucinating, sometimes you need the person who built the brain. The cabin was silent, except for the sound of wind rushing past the wounded aircraft. Miguel Santos looked around helplessly. The banker in 3B was praying. Other passengers were crying, texting final messages to families, or staring out windows at the black ocean below. Cameron Blake unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood up in the aisle, balancing against the steep angle of the aircraft's descent. Every eye in first class turned toward him, the man in the faded hoodie who had been called a thief, a thug, a criminal. "I can help," Cameron said, his voice projected clearly toward Rosa, who was strapped into the jump seat near the cockpit door. Isabella grabbed his wrist with both hands. "Sit down," she screamed. "You're going to kill us all. You don't know anything about airplanes." Cameron looked down at her hand on his wrist. He didn't pull away this time. Instead, he leaned down until his face was inches from hers, his voice deadly calm. "My name is Dr. Cameron Blake. I am the senior lead engineer for propulsion integration systems on this aircraft series. I wrote the computer code that is currently failing." His eyes bore into hers like lasers. "Now let go of my arm, Mrs. Hartwell, or you will die in this seat." Isabella's hand went slack. Her mouth fell open, but no sound came out. Cameron stepped over her legs and moved toward the cockpit door where Rosa was staring at him with wide eyes. He reached into his bag and pulled out his identification badge, a badge that bore the logos of 3 major aerospace defense contractors, and the words, "Senior Systems Engineer, Classified Access." "Tell the captain," Cameron said, holding up the badge. "Tell him I know how to bypass the lockout." Rosa didn't hesitate. She unbuckled from her jump seat, grabbed the interphone, and called the cockpit. "Captain, there's a passenger here. He says he's the lead engineer for propulsion integration. He says he wrote the code." Captain Walsh's voice came back immediately. "Send him up now." Cameron disappeared into the cockpit. The heavy door clicked shut and locked behind him, leaving Isabella alone in the cabin with the crushing weight of realization. She had just called the man who designed the airplane a street criminal. She had tried to have the only person who could save them all arrested for theft. She looked down at her lap, and there, wedged between the seat cushion and the side panel where it had fallen during her drunken tantrum hours earlier, was the glint of diamonds. Her bracelet. It hadn't been stolen. It had slipped off when she was flailing around, screaming at Rosa during takeoff. Isabella stared at the jewelry, then at the closed cockpit door. For the first time in her life, the weight of her actions hit her harder than the G-force of their descent. Inside the cockpit, the world was pure chaos. Red lights bathed the small space in hellish color. Alarms screamed, "Pull up, terrain, stall." Captain Walsh and her first officer, a young man named David Chen, were wrestling with controls that no longer responded like they should. "Talk to me," Cameron said, squeezing into the jump seat behind them. "Engine 1 is dead," Captain Walsh shouted without looking back. Engine 2 is at idle, but it won't throttle up. The computer thinks we're on the ground because of a sensor failure in the landing gear assembly. It's refusing to let us increase power because it thinks we're taxiing at the gate. It's the squat switch logic, Cameron said instantly, his engineer's mind already 3 steps ahead of the problem. It's a fail-safe to prevent thrust deployment when parked. If the sensor is shorted, the plane thinks it's still on the ground. How do we override it? David yelled over the alarms. You can't do it from the overhead panel, Cameron said, his eyes scanning the dozens of displays and switches. He reached forward, pointing to a circuit breaker panel behind the first officer's head, a panel usually reserved for maintenance crews working on the ground. You have to pull the circuit breaker for the air-ground logic relay, but if you pull the wrong one, you lose the flight control computers entirely. Show me, Captain Walsh commanded. Cameron didn't just point. He unbuckled from his seat, leaned over the center console, and placed his finger on a tiny nondescript black breaker labeled AGLGC2. This one, Cameron said. Pull it. The computer will reboot in air mode by default. You'll have about 5 seconds of total darkness on all the screens before they come back online. Do not panic during those 5 seconds. If we lose the screens, we're flying blind in clouds, David argued, sweat dripping down his face. If you don't pull it, Cameron countered, his voice devoid of fear. We hit the ocean in 90 seconds. This is pure physics now. Captain Walsh looked at Cameron. She saw the intelligence in his eyes, the absolute calm in the face of catastrophe. This was a man who understood exactly what was at stake. Do it, she commanded. Cameron pulled the breaker. Everything went black. The glass screens died. The alarms stopped. The silence was absolute and terrifying. 1 Mississippi, Cameron counted aloud in the darkness. 2 Mississippi. In the cabin, Isabella felt the plane dip even more sharply. Screams erupted from economy class. 3 Mississippi. 4 Mississippi. Come on, Captain Walsh whispered in the dark. 5 Mississippi. The screens flickered back to life like electronic angels. The artificial horizon stabilized, and suddenly the engine display for number 2 changed from idle to ready. Full power, Cameron shouted. Captain Walsh slammed the throttle forward. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then a low rumble began deep in the aircraft's belly. It grew into a roar that passengers could feel in their chests. The single remaining engine screamed as it fought to lift 300 tons of metal away from the Atlantic Ocean. The altimeter stopped its death spiral. It held steady at 4,000 feet. Then, slowly and painfully, it began to climb. We have thrust. David exhaled, his voice cracking with relief. We have thrust. But Cameron wasn't celebrating yet. You're burning twice the normal fuel to maintain altitude on one engine. You need to divert immediately. Gander, Newfoundland, is closest. Roger. Setting course for Gander. Cameron remained in the cockpit monitoring systems that he had helped design, serving as a silent guardian for the 298 people who had watched him be humiliated just hours before. The landing in Gander was rough. Snow whipped across the runway and the single engine strained against the crosswinds, but Captain Walsh brought them down with a bone-jarring thud that felt like the most beautiful sensation in the world. As Flight 847 taxied toward the terminal surrounded by fire trucks and emergency vehicles with flashing lights, the relief in the cabin was palpable. Phones turned on passengers, texted families, and the reality of survival began to sink in. Isabella sat frozen in her seat, the recovered bracelet clutched in her sweating palm. She shoved it deep into her coat pocket, her mind racing through damage control scenarios. She needed to get off this plane. She needed to control the narrative before it controlled her. The cockpit door opened and Cameron stepped out. His hoodie was wrinkled, his face exhausted, but his eyes were calm. He looked at Isabella briefly, not with anger or triumph, but with something that looked almost like pity. Captain Walsh's voice filled the cabin, shaky but proud. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Gander, Newfoundland. I want to offer special thanks to a passenger, Dr. Cameron Blake, whose expertise was critical in getting us safely on the ground." Applause erupted. It started in economy class and swept forward like a wave. People were cheering, crying, clapping. Miguel Santos stood up and applauded. Rosa Martinez was openly weeping as she clapped. Isabella did not clap. She stared straight ahead, her mind calculating her next move. The main cabin door opened and freezing Canadian air rushed in, but it wasn't just ground crew who entered the aircraft. 2 officers from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police stepped onto the plane, big men in heavy winter parkas with badges that caught the cabin lights. Isabella perked up immediately. This was her chance, her salvation. She stood up, smoothing her cashmere coat, and instantly resumed her CEO's wife persona. "Officers," she called out, stepping into the aisle to block their path toward Cameron. "Over here, I want to report a crime. That man," she pointed directly at Cameron, "assaulted me and threatened the flight crew. I want him arrested immediately." The cabin went dead silent. The audacity was breathtaking. After Cameron had just saved 298 lives, Isabella was still trying to destroy him. One of the RCMP officers looked at his clipboard, then at Isabella with the expression of a man who had dealt with entitled tourists before. "Are you Isabella Hartwell?" the officer asked. "Yes," she said, lifting her chin with practiced arrogance. "And I demand you take this man into custody immediately." The officer stepped forward. He walked right past Cameron without a glance. He stopped directly in front of Isabella. "Isabella Hartwell," the officer said in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority. "Please, turn around and place your hands behind your back." Isabella blinked. "Excuse me. You are under arrest for interference with a flight crew assault on a passenger and creating a disturbance on board an aircraft. We have witness statements from the flight crew transmitted via data link regarding your behavior prior to the emergency." "What?" Isabella screeched, her voice climbing toward hysteria. "No. You have the wrong person. He stole my bracelet. He's the criminal. The bracelet you're clutching in your pocket." Miguel Santos had stepped forward, his phone in his hand. "I saw her put it there when we landed. She found it in her seat. She's been lying the entire flight." Isabella's hand flew to her pocket involuntarily. She pulled out the diamond bracelet as if it were on fire. I found it," she stammered. "I was going to tell Save It for the judge," the officer said. He spun her around with professional efficiency. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was loud and final in the quiet cabin. "Do you know who my husband is?" Isabella screamed as they marched her toward the door. "Derek Hartwell. He will buy your entire department. He will buy this country. I am a victim here." As she was dragged past Cameron, she looked at him one final time, expecting to see triumph in his eyes. But Cameron Blake looked at her with something far more devastating than anger. He looked at her with pity. "You missed the point," Isabella Cameron said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the silent cabin. "Gravity doesn't care how much money you have, and neither does the truth." Isabella Hartwell was dragged off Atlantic Airways Flight 847 with her cashmere coat trailing in the snow and her screams echoing across the tarmac of Gander International Airport. But her humiliation was just beginning. News travels fast in the digital age, but bad news travels at the speed of light. While Isabella was being processed in a stark fluorescent-lit holding cell stripped of her shoelaces, her Cartier bracelet, and her dignity, the world outside was waking up to her face. Inside the terminal, the 298 survivors of Flight 847 weren't just resting and drinking bad coffee. They were uploading. Miguel Santos hadn't been idle during the flight. With the calculating precision of a man who understood viral marketing better than anyone alive, he had documented everything. His phone contained crystal-clear footage of Isabella screaming racial slurs, throwing her drink, demanding strip searches, and most damaging of all, the exact moment she physically assaulted Cameron Blake right before the engine exploded. Miguel worked quickly editing the footage on his phone with the ruthless efficiency of a media mogul. He uploaded the clips to every major platform simultaneously: YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. His caption was simple and devastating: the face of entitlement versus the face of heroism. This woman tried to arrest the engineer who just saved 300 lives. Hashtag Flight 847. Hashtag Isabella Hartwell. Hashtag Meridian Industries. The hashtags were strategically chosen. Within an hour, hashtag Isabella Hartwell was trending globally. Within 3 hours, the video had 5 million views. By the time the sun rose over Manhattan, it had reached 40 million. The comments section became a digital war zone. This is what privilege looks like. Lock her up and throw away the key. That man is a hero, and she tried to destroy him. The outrage was universal, crossing every demographic line. People shared their own stories of discrimination, of being judged by appearance, of watching entitled individuals abuse service workers and minorities. But the story didn't stay contained to social media. Traditional news outlets picked it up within hours. CNN ran it as breaking news. Fox covered it wall to wall. The BBC led their morning broadcast with footage of Isabella in handcuffs. International media from Japan to Germany ran headlines about American privilege gone wrong. The Canadian press had a field day. Isabella had insulted their police, their legal system, and their country on camera. Editorial writers across Canada called for maximum prosecution. Members of Parliament demanded answers about how someone could behave this way toward a hero who had saved hundreds of lives. Meanwhile, in his corner office overlooking Manhattan, Derek Hartwell stood frozen before a wall-mounted monitor displaying his wife's meltdown on an endless loop. Derek Hartwell was a man made of shark skin and ice water. As CEO of Meridian Industries, one of the largest aerospace and defense contractors in the world, he was accustomed to crisis management. Supply chain disruptions, labor strikes, congressional investigations. He had weathered them all with money lawyers and strategic political donations. But he couldn't buy his way out of this. His chief of public relations, a battle-hardened woman named Sarah Chen, walked into his office looking like she had seen the apocalypse. "It's bad, Derek," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "It's trending #1 globally across every platform. The stock is down 12% in pre-market trading. The board is calling for an emergency meeting at noon, and 3 major clients have already suspended their contracts pending review." Derek stared at the monitor, watching his wife transform from entitled socialite to hysterical criminal in high definition. The woman he had married for her social connections and political usefulness was now radioactive. "Who's the guy?" Derek asked, his voice emotionless. "That's the worst part," Sarah said, consulting her tablet with the expression of someone reading a death sentence. "His name is Dr. Cameron Blake. He's not just any engineer. He's the engineer. He holds 14 patents for turbine cooling systems that we use in half our military contracts. He was flying to London to accept a knighthood recommendation from the Queen for his work in sustainable aviation technology." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "Derek, he's a national treasure, and your wife treated him like a street criminal. On camera, in front of witnesses, while he was on his way to be honored by foreign heads of state." Derek closed his eyes. He felt the familiar sensation of a perfectly constructed life crumbling beneath his feet. In his world, when an asset became toxic, you liquidated it immediately. No sentiment, no emotion, just cold business calculation. "Get the lawyers," Derek said. not for her defense for the divorce, and draft a statement immediately distancing the company from her personal views. "You're not going to help her?" Sarah asked, surprised by his coldness, despite knowing him for 8 years. Derek turned back toward the window, his reflection ghost-like against the Manhattan skyline. "She made her bed in first class. Now she can sleep in it. 3 time zones away in the RCMP holding facility in Gander, Newfoundland." Isabella Hartwell sat on a narrow metal cot in a gray jumpsuit that smelled of industrial detergent. The cashmere coat was gone. The diamond jewelry was gone. The perfectly styled hair was matted and unkempt. She was shivering not from the cold, but from withdrawal. The alcohol had worn off hours ago, leaving her with a pounding headache and a terrifying clarity about her situation. But Isabella still believed in the power of her connections. Derek would fix this. Derek always fixed everything. She had one phone call and she knew exactly how to use it. The phone rang twice before Derek's familiar voice answered. "Hello?" Isabella sobbed into the receiver, years of practiced manipulation flooding into her voice. "Oh God, Derek, it's a nightmare. These barbarians arrested me. They took my jewelry. You have to get the jet up here immediately. You have to call Senator Morrison. Call Judge Patterson. That man ruined everything." Silence. Long, heavy, deadly silence. Isabella's voice became smaller, more desperate. "Victoria," Derek said finally, using her middle name in the way he only did when he was furious. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I didn't do anything," she protested. "I was the victim. He assaulted me." "Stop." Derek's voice cut like a blade. "I've seen the video. The whole world has seen the video. You assaulted a man who saved 300 lives. You jeopardized the safety of an aircraft. You are a public relations nuclear bomb, and you just detonated in my company's face." "But I'm your wife," Isabella whimpered. "Not for much longer," Derek said with the coldness of liquid nitrogen. "The board met an hour ago. They're demanding my resignation unless I completely cut ties with you. I've worked 30 years to build this company. I'm not letting you burn it down because you couldn't handle your vodka and your racism." "Derek, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that my legal team has been instructed not to represent you in any criminal proceedings. I'm saying that divorce papers are being filed within the hour. I'm saying that you are completely, utterly on your own." The line went dead. Isabella stared at the receiver as the dial tone buzzed like an angry insect. She dropped the phone and curled into a ball on the hard cot, finally understanding that the checkbook was closed, the shield was gone, and the key to her cage had just been thrown away by the only person she thought she owned. 3 months later, the air inside courtroom 4B of the Federal District Court for the Eastern District of New York was heavy with tension and the nervous sweat of 50 people crammed into the gallery. It was a suffocating atmosphere, a sharp contrast to the climate-controlled luxury Isabella Hartwell had breathed for nearly 4 decades. She sat at the defense table, her posture rigid, hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. The transformation from Manhattan socialite to federal defendant was startling and complete. Gone was the cream-colored cashmere coat that had once cost more than most people's cars. Gone were the diamond studs that had graced her ears at charity galas. Even her hair, once a weaponized helmet of platinum perfection maintained by a team of stylists, was pulled back into a severe fraying bun that exposed the deep stress lines etching her forehead. She wore a navy blue suit purchased off the rack at Macy's, a polyester blend that didn't fit quite right in the shoulders and bunched awkwardly at the waist. It was the uniform of a woman whose assets had been frozen, whose credit cards had been canceled, and whose social circle had evaporated like morning mist. The seat behind her, traditionally reserved for family support, was conspicuously empty. Derek Hartwell was not there. He had not called, had not visited, had not even acknowledged her existence since that phone call in the Canadian jail cell. Instead, 3 days earlier, a junior associate from his law firm had wordlessly slid a manila envelope across a scratched metal table in the courthouse's visitation room. The divorce papers were signed. The dissolution of their marriage had been executed with the same cold efficiency Derek brought to corporate acquisitions. Cleaner and faster than the engine failure on Flight 847, their union was officially terminated. Isabella was utterly, completely alone. At the prosecutor's table sat James Rodriguez, a formidable attorney with a reputation for methodically dismantling white-collar criminals who thought their wealth made them untouchable. Rodriguez didn't need theatrical gestures or courtroom dramatics. He had something far more powerful: the footage. "Your Honor," Rodriguez said, rising from his chair with the casual confidence of a man holding 4 aces. The people would like to play Exhibit A one final time before closing arguments. Isabella flinched as if she'd been struck. She stared down at the scratched wood of the defense table, refusing to look at the large monitors mounted on the courtroom walls, but she couldn't shut out the sound. The audio filled the courtroom, tinny and piercing through the speakers. It was her own voice, distorted by rage and vodka, echoing from the past like a ghost of her former self. "People like you don't belong in first class. You look like you rob convenience stores. You lower the property value just by sitting there." The courtroom murmured a low, ugly sound of collective judgment. Then came the crescendo, Isabella's hysterical screaming as she physically lunged at Cameron Blake, followed by the sickening sound of the camera shaking as Flight 847's engine exploded. Rodriguez paused the video on a freeze frame of Isabella's face, twisted with hate and terror, her mouth open in a scream that seemed to embody every ugly impulse of entitlement and racism. The defense claims that Mrs. Hartwell was merely stressed and unwell. Rodriguez said, his voice cutting through the silence like a surgeon's scalpel. But what you see on that screen isn't stress. It's the complete breakdown of human decency during a life-or-death crisis. She didn't just insult a passenger, she actively endangered every soul on board that aircraft. He gestured toward the frozen image. This woman attacked the one person capable of saving her life, and she did it because of the color of his skin and the clothes on his back. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this isn't just about racism. This is about a level of entitlement so toxic that it nearly caused mass murder. Rodriguez returned to his seat, and the courtroom fell silent except for the whisper of the ventilation system and Isabella's barely audible breathing. The people call their final witness, Dr. Cameron Blake. A hush fell over the courtroom as the heavy oak doors swung open. Cameron walked in, and the contrast with Isabella was devastating. Where she looked diminished and broken, Cameron appeared like a man carved from dignity itself. He wore a charcoal gray suit, perfectly tailored, that emphasized his tall frame and broad shoulders. He walked with an unhurried cadence, neither fast nor slow, but with the measured pace of someone who had briefed presidents and advised generals. He didn't look at the press section packed with reporters. He didn't acknowledge the sketch artists frantically capturing his entrance. He did, however, make brief eye contact with Isabella. It wasn't a look of anger or triumph. It was something far more devastating, profound, distant pity. The expression of someone looking at a broken thing that could have been repaired, but had chosen destruction instead. Cameron took the witness stand and was sworn in, his right hand steady on the Bible, his voice clear and strong as he swore to tell the truth. Dr. Blake Rodriguez began pacing slowly before the jury box like a professor addressing students. "You are recognized as one of the world's leading experts in aviation propulsion systems. Can you explain to this court in terms that ordinary people can understand the exact danger posed by the defendant's actions?" Cameron leaned slightly toward the microphone. His voice was a rich baritone, steady and precise, carrying the authority of someone who had spent his career solving problems that kept entire governments awake at night. When a GE-90 turbine suffers catastrophic containment failure, Cameron began. The flight crew has a window of approximately 10 to 15 seconds to diagnose the issue and take corrective action before the aircraft enters an unrecoverable state. It is a moment requiring absolute critical focus. He turned toward the jury, his dark eyes engaging directly with the 12 men and women who would decide Isabella's fate. Mrs. Hartwell physically assaulted me and created chaos in the cabin at the exact moment our number 1 engine exploded. If the flight crew had been distracted by her assault for even 5 seconds longer, if Captain Walsh had hesitated because of the disruption Mrs. Hartwell created, we would have entered what's called a stall spin. Cameron paused, letting the technical term hang in the air before explaining its meaning. A stall spin at 35,000 feet with asymmetric thrust from a single engine is not survivable. The aircraft would have struck the Atlantic Ocean at approximately 500 miles per hour. All 298 souls on board would have perished. He leaned back slightly, his expression grave. Mrs. Hartwell didn't just attack my dignity or hurt my feelings. Her actions at that specific moment actively sabotaged the survival of nearly 300 human beings. Isabella's court-appointed defense attorney, a tired man named Robert Chen, who knew he was fighting an unwinnable battle, rose for cross-examination. He shuffled his papers with the weary resignation of someone trying to polish a turd. Dr. Blake Chen said my client was heavily intoxicated. She was clearly suffering from acute anxiety and panic. Surely you can see that her actions weren't malicious, but were the result of chemical impairment and psychological distress. Cameron looked at the lawyer with the same clinical detachment he had once shown Isabella. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but carried the weight of absolute moral authority. Sir, I have seen many people afraid. I have seen people terrified beyond rational thought. Fear makes you quiet. Fear makes you small. Fear makes you pray. Cameron's eyes moved to Isabella, then back to the lawyer. Fear does not make you a racist. Fear does not make you attack innocent people. Fear does not make you entitled. Chen pressed on desperately. But surely the alcohol is not a creator of personality. Cameron interrupted, his voice hardening into steel. Alcohol is a developer like photographic developer. It doesn't create the image, it reveals what was already there on the negative. It doesn't invent racism, and it doesn't manufacture entitlement. It simply removes the social filter that normally keeps those qualities hidden. The defense attorney sat down, having accomplished nothing except making his client look worse. The jury deliberated for exactly 45 minutes. It would have been shorter, but they needed time to complete the paperwork properly. When the foreman stood to read the verdict, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming in the ceiling. On the charge of interference with a flight crew, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of assault on a passenger, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of creating a disturbance that endangered an aircraft, we find the defendant guilty. Isabella didn't cry. She felt a cold numbness spreading through her chest, as if her heart were slowly turning to stone. Judge Patricia Coleman, a stern woman with steel gray hair and zero tolerance for the antics of the wealthy, looked down from the bench. She had reviewed the sentencing guidelines, but she set them aside. This case required a personal touch. Isabella Hartwell. Judge Coleman began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute judicial authority. You have lived a life of extraordinary privilege. You believed that your husband's name and your social status were shields that would protect you from the consequences of your own cruelty. You believed that the basic rules of human decency were for other people. Isabella began to tremble, sensing what was coming. You were wrong. Judge Coleman said, the words falling like hammer blows. For the charge of interference with a flight crew, I sentence you to 36 months in federal prison. For the assault charges, an additional 12 months to be served concurrently. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay restitution to Atlantic Airways in the amount of $250,000 to cover the costs of the emergency diversion fuel dumping and passenger accommodations. Isabella gasped a sharp, ragged intake of breath. 3 years. 3 years in a cage surrounded by the kind of people she had spent her entire life looking down upon. But Judge Coleman wasn't finished. Finally, the judge leaned forward, her eyes boring into Isabella's soul, pursuant to Federal Aviation Administration regulations regarding violent interference with flight operations. You are hereby placed on the federal no-fly list. Permanently. The color drained from Isabella's face completely. Permanently, she whispered. You will never set foot on a commercial aircraft in the United States again, Judge Coleman declared, banging her gavel with finality. You are grounded, Miss Hartwell, for life. As the U.S. Marshals moved in to handcuff her, the full weight of her sentence crashed down like a collapsing building. No more Paris Fashion Weeks. No more winters in Aspen. No more escapes to Caribbean islands when New York became tedious. She was trapped on the ground forever, just like everyone else she had spent her life looking down upon. While Isabella was being processed, fingerprinted, and assigned a federal inmate number in Manhattan, her husband Derek was 300 miles away in Washington, D.C., adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of a polished mahogany conference table. He sat in the secured briefing room of the Department of Defense, surrounded by generals, admirals, and defense contractors who collectively controlled billions in taxpayer dollars. This was supposed to be his salvation, meeting the presentation that would save Meridian Industries from the public relations disaster his ex-wife had created. Despite the scandal, despite the global humiliation, Derek remained confident. Meridian Industries was the frontrunner for the Titan contract, a $10 billion government initiative to develop next-generation propulsion systems for military transport aircraft. It was the golden parachute that would rescue his stock price and restore his company's reputation. Gentlemen, Derek said, flashing his practiced smile at the panel of military officials, Meridian Industries is ready to serve. Our engineering capabilities are unmatched. Our security clearances are impeccable. We are the only logical choice for the Titan project. General Robert Matthews, a gruff man with 3 stars on his shoulders and 30 years of military service, nodded slowly. Your technical proposal is strong, Mr. Hartwell. The specifications are impressive. However, as you know, a contract of this magnitude involving national security requires final approval from the Civilian Oversight Director of Aviation Engineering. He has absolute veto power over all military aerospace contracts. Derek's confidence didn't waver. Of course, General. I welcome the scrutiny. I'm certain the Director will recognize that Meridian Industries represents America's best interests. He's right here, General Matthews said. Director, would you like to review the proposal? At the head of the table, a high-backed leather chair slowly swiveled around. Derek's practiced smile froze on his face. The blood in his veins turned to ice water. His heart hammered against his ribs in an irregular, panicked rhythm. Sitting in the director's chair, wearing an American flag pin on his lapel and looking every inch the senior government official, was Dr. Cameron Blake. Following the miracle landing at Gander and the global recognition of his heroism, the president hadn't just awarded Cameron a medal. He had appointed him to clean up the aviation industry from the inside. Cameron Blake was no longer just an engineer or a consultant. He was the gatekeeper, the man who decided which companies were worthy of the American taxpayers' trust. Cameron opened a thick black folder labeled Meridian Industries, Titan Project Proposal. He put on reading glasses and peered at Derek over the rims with the expression of a man examining something distasteful. Mr. Hartwell. Cameron said pleasantly, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had possessed in the cockpit of Flight 847. How good to see you again, Dr. Freeman. Derek stammered, his throat suddenly dry. I wasn't aware you had joined the administration. I've been reviewing your company's propulsion schematics for the past week, Cameron said, tapping the papers with a manicured finger. The engineering is adequate. However, the Titan contract has very strict clauses regarding corporate ethics, leadership stability, and public trust. The United States government cannot partner with entities that demonstrate fundamental character flaws. Character flaws. Derek choked out, gripping the armrests of his chair. I divorced her. She's in federal prison. I completely severed all ties. Cameron's expression didn't change. He closed the folder with deliberate slowness. The sound echoed through the silent room like a judge's gavel. This isn't about your ex-wife, Derek. Cameron said, his voice dropping to a register that made the generals lean forward. This is about you. Me. Derek's voice cracked. During the discovery phase of the criminal investigation, I had the opportunity to review Meridian Industries' internal communications, Cameron revealed. You knew about the hydraulic valve deterioration in your civilian aircraft fleet 6 months ago. Your own engineers warned you in writing. You marked those reports as acceptable risk to avoid maintenance costs. The room went deadly silent. Every military official was staring at Derek with growing disgust. The same type of hydraulic valve that failed on Flight 847. Cameron continued relentlessly. The valve that nearly killed 298 people. You didn't just enable your wife's racism, you gambled with hundreds of lives to save money on your spreadsheets. Cameron picked up a heavy red rubber stamp. He held it over the Meridian Industries proposal for a long moment, letting Derek watch and understand what was about to happen. Then he brought it down with a decisive thud. Rejected, Cameron announced to the room. Meridian Industries is hereby suspended from all federal contracting for 10 years, pending a comprehensive safety audit by the FAA, the DOT, and the Department of Defense. You can't do this. Derek stood up, his face turning purple with rage. This is revenge. You're punishing me because she insulted you. Cameron stood as well, gathering his papers with agonizing slowness. When he looked at Derek, his eyes held no anger, no satisfaction, no emotion at all, just the cold calculation of justice being served. No, Derek, Cameron said quietly. Your ex-wife was a passenger. You were the CEO. She was rude to me. You were negligent with human lives. This isn't revenge. This is accountability. 1 year later, the fall of the Hartwell empire was complete. Meridian Industries declared bankruptcy within 3 months of losing the Titan contract. Derek was buried under an avalanche of shareholder lawsuits, SEC investigations, and criminal charges related to the hydraulic valve cover-up. He lost the penthouse overlooking Central Park. He lost the estate in the Hamptons. He lost his reputation, his company, and his name. But the real transformation wasn't happening in corporate boardrooms or federal courthouses. It was happening 35,000 feet above the ground in the cabins of commercial aircraft around the world. Atlantic Airways had become the first airline to implement what the industry now called the Blake Protocol, a comprehensive system designed to eliminate discrimination and ensure passenger dignity. Every employee, from baggage handlers to senior executives, underwent intensive training that included real-life scenarios, role-playing exercises, and direct testimony from passengers who had experienced discrimination. The footage from Flight 847 became the centerpiece of this training, not as a shame tactic, but as a teaching tool. Flight attendants watched Isabella's meltdown and learned to recognize the warning signs of entitled behavior before it escalated. Gate agents studied Cameron's dignified responses and understood that assumptions about passengers based on appearance were not just morally wrong, they were operationally dangerous. Within 6 months, other airlines began implementing similar protocols. Delta created the Passenger Dignity Initiative. United launched Respect at Altitude. Southwest developed Hospitality Without Assumptions. The Federal Aviation Administration made anti-discrimination training mandatory for all airline employees, and the Department of Transportation began tracking complaints with new precision. The cultural shift was measurable. Passenger complaint rates dropped by 60% industry-wide. Customer satisfaction scores reached all-time highs. More importantly, stories began emerging of flight crews going out of their way to treat every passenger with respect, regardless of age, race, clothing, or apparent economic status. Rosa Martinez, the flight attendant who had witnessed Isabella's assault on Cameron, became Atlantic Airways Director of Passenger Experience. In interviews, she spoke about how the incident had changed not just airline policies, but her own perspective on passenger service. "We used to make assumptions about people based on how they looked, how they dressed, whether they seemed to belong in first class," Rosa said during a CNN interview. "Dr. Blake taught us that you never know who someone really is until you treat them with basic human respect. The man we thought was just another passenger turned out to be the person who saved all our lives." Miguel Santos, the tech entrepreneur who had documented Isabella's behavior, established the Santos Foundation for Transportation Equity, which provided legal support for passengers who experienced discrimination during travel. The foundation's first case involved an elderly Hispanic woman who had been removed from a flight for looking suspicious while reading a Spanish-language newspaper. The ripple effects extended beyond aviation. Hotels, restaurants, retail stores, and other service industries began examining their own practices and training protocols. The phrase, the Isabella Hartwell effect, entered popular vocabulary as shorthand for the consequences of unchecked entitlement and institutional discrimination. But perhaps the most significant change was happening in the quiet moments that never made headlines. Flight attendants pausing to really listen when passengers had concerns. Gate agents taking extra time to explain policies clearly and respectfully. Pilots emerging from cockpits to personally thank passengers who had endured delays with patience and grace. Cameron Blake, meanwhile, had become something he never wanted to be a symbol. His calm dignity in the face of racist abuse, combined with his heroic actions during the emergency, made him the reluctant face of grace under pressure. Speaking requests poured in from universities, corporations, and civic organizations around the world. But Cameron remained focused on the work rather than the acclaim. As Director of Aviation Safety and Ethics, he quietly implemented changes that would prevent future Isabella Hartwells from endangering aircraft and passengers. His new regulations required real-time reporting of all passenger conflicts, mandatory de-escalation training for crew members, and strict penalties for airlines that failed to address discriminatory behavior. "The goal isn't punishment," Cameron said during his first press conference as director. "The goal is prevention. We want to create a culture where respect is automatic, where dignity is standard, and where everyone feels safe to travel regardless of who they are or what they look like." 18 months after Flight 847. Cameron Blake found himself back in the Atlantic Airways first-class cabin, occupying the same seat where his life had changed forever. Flight 847 from JFK to Heathrow. The same route, the same aircraft type, even some of the same crew members. But everything else was different. Rosa Martinez greeted him at the aircraft door, her smile genuine and warm. "Dr. Blake, welcome aboard. It's an honor to have you flying with us today." "Thank you, Rosa. Just Cameron is fine." As he settled into seat 1, Cameron reflected on how much had changed not just in the aviation industry, but in his own life. The Presidential Medal of Freedom sat in a simple frame on his office wall, but it wasn't the awards or recognition that mattered to him. It was the letters, thousands of them from passengers who had experienced discrimination and found the courage to speak up after seeing his example, from flight attendants who had learned to see passengers as individuals rather than stereotypes, from young engineers who had been inspired to enter aerospace careers because they saw someone who looked like them in a position of authority and respect. The flight to London was peaceful in the way that airline travel should be, but rarely is. Professional service without assumptions, courtesy without conditions, and the quiet dignity that comes when human beings treat each other as human beings. As they crossed over the Atlantic, Cameron looked down at the dark waters where Flight 847 had nearly met its end. He thought about the concept of grace, not just the aerodynamic kind that kept aircraft aloft, but the human kind that lifted people above their circumstances. He thought about Isabella Hartwell, 3 time zones away in the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. Isabella was experiencing a world she had never imagined existed. The orange jumpsuit was a far cry from designer dresses. The shared cell with its metal toilet and thin mattress bore no resemblance to her former penthouse suite. The cafeteria food, the work assignments, the rigid schedule, everything was a reminder of how far she had fallen. But perhaps more jarring than the physical conditions was the realization that her fellow inmates didn't care about her former status. To them, she wasn't the wife of a CEO or a member of high society. She was just another prisoner who had done something stupid and gotten caught. Isabella's cellmate was a woman named Maria Santos, a former bank teller who had embezzled money to pay for her daughter's cancer treatments. Maria was everything Isabella had once looked down upon, poor, Hispanic, uneducated by elite standards. But in the strange ecosystem of prison, Maria had become Isabella's protector and unlikely friend. "You ever think about what you're going to do when you get out?" Maria asked one evening as they lay in their narrow bunks. Isabella stared at the ceiling where someone had scratched time heels into the concrete. "I don't know. I can't fly anywhere. I have no money. My husband divorced me. I don't even know if I have any friends left." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Maria said quietly. "Sometimes you gotta lose everything before you can figure out who you really are." Isabella wanted to argue to explain that Maria didn't understand the magnitude of what she had lost. But as the months passed, she began to see the truth in her cellmate's words. Stripped of wealth status and the ability to intimidate others with her connections, Isabella was forced to confront the person she had become. The prison library became her refuge. Not because she had suddenly developed a love of literature, but because it was quiet, and in the quiet she could no longer avoid thinking about Cameron Blake. Not the version she had constructed in her mind, the threatening stranger who didn't belong in first class, but the real man who had saved her life despite her cruelty. She read about him sometimes in the newspapers and magazines that made their way into the prison. Dr. Cameron Blake, receiving awards, implementing new safety protocols, speaking at universities about dignity and leadership. In every photo, he looked calm and thoughtful, the same expression he had worn when helping her with her seatbelt, as their plane plummeted toward the ocean. Isabella began writing letters she never intended to send. Apologies that seemed inadequate explanations, that sounded like excuses, attempts to articulate remorse for actions that had wounded not just Cameron, but her own soul. She wrote about the person she had been, and the person she was slowly, painfully learning to become. Meanwhile, Derek Hartwell's fall from grace was playing out in a very different venue. Criminal charges related to the hydraulic valve cover-up had been dropped due to prosecutorial discretion, but the civil lawsuits had destroyed him financially. He now lived in a studio apartment in Queens, working as a logistics consultant for small companies that couldn't afford better expertise. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The man who had once commanded billion-dollar budgets now rode the subway to meetings in strip mall offices. He had learned too late that reputation was like virginity. Once lost, it could never truly be recovered. Derek occasionally saw news coverage of Cameron Blake's growing influence in the aviation industry, and each time he felt a mixture of envy and grudging respect. The man his wife had tried to destroy had not only survived, but had transformed an entire industry. There was a lesson in that, though Derek was still too proud to fully absorb it. But the most profound transformations were happening in places that would never make headlines. At airports across the country, gate agents paused before making assumptions about passengers. Flight attendants engaged with travelers as individuals rather than stereotypes. Pilots took extra moments to explain delays or changes in plans, understanding that basic courtesy could prevent conflicts before they started. Captain Jennifer Walsh, who had flown Flight 847 through its darkest hour, became a vocal advocate for crew training and passenger dignity. In speeches to aviation groups, she often referenced that night over the Atlantic. "We had 2 crises on Flight 847, she would tell audiences. One was mechanical and engine failure that we could see and measure and fix. The other was human, a failure of basic decency that was far more dangerous than any mechanical problem. Dr. Blake didn't just save us from hitting the ocean. He saved us from hitting a much darker bottom." The Blake Protocol had been adopted by airlines in 17 countries. Flight crews around the world watched the footage from Flight 847 and learned to recognize the warning signs of discriminatory behavior before it escalated into crisis. More importantly, they learned that treating every passenger with dignity wasn't just the right thing to do, it was essential for safety. Young people, particularly young people of color who had grown up seeing themselves as unwelcome in certain spaces, began to see air travel differently. The image of Cameron Blake in his Harvard hoodie, calmly demonstrating that belonging wasn't about appearance, resonated across generational and cultural lines. Engineering schools reported increased enrollment among underrepresented minorities, many citing Cameron's example as inspiration. The Cameron Blake STEM Scholarship, funded by his speaking fees and book royalties, provided full tuition for students from disadvantaged backgrounds who wanted to pursue careers in aerospace engineering. But perhaps the most meaningful change was also the most subtle, the gradual shift in how people talked to each other in public spaces. The Isabella Hartwell incident had held up a mirror to society's casual cruelties, and many people didn't like what they saw reflected back. Stories emerged of bus drivers being more patient with elderly passengers, of restaurant servers showing equal courtesy to all customers, regardless of appearance, of retail workers refusing to follow customers they suspected of potential shoplifting based solely on racial profiling. The Hartwell effect became shorthand for what happened when unchecked privilege met consequences. But it also represented something more positive: the possibility of choosing dignity over prejudice even when no one was watching. 2 years after Flight 847, Cameron Blake received an unexpected letter at his office in Washington, D.C. It bore the return address of the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, and the sender's name, Isabella Hartwell. Cameron stared at the envelope for several minutes before opening it. Inside was 3 pages of handwriting, not the entitled scrawl of the woman he remembered, but careful, deliberate script that looked like it had been written and rewritten many times. Dr. Blake. It began. "I know I have no right to write to you, and I don't expect you to read this, much less respond. But I needed to try to find words for something I should have said 2 years ago on a plane over the Atlantic Ocean. I am sorry. Not sorry that I got caught or sorry that I went to prison, but sorry for who I was when I looked at you in that first-class cabin. Sorry for the assumptions I made based on your appearance. Sorry for the names I called you, the lies I told about you, and the way I tried to destroy you even as you were saving my life. Prison has given me time to think about the person I was before Flight 847. I don't like what I see when I look back at that woman. She was cruel not because she was drunk or scared, but because she believed that her comfort mattered more than other people's dignity. She believed that her preferences were more important than common decency. I can't take back what I did or said. I can't undo the pain I caused or the example I set. But I can tell you that the woman who wrote these words is trying to be different from the woman who attacked you on that airplane. I don't expect forgiveness. I haven't forgiven myself. But I wanted you to know that your grace in that moment, the way you helped me with my seatbelt, even after I had assaulted you, taught me more about human dignity than 40 years of privilege had taught me about anything. You could have let me die in that seat. No one would have blamed you. Instead, you chose to be better than I had been to you. That choice saved more than my life. It saved the possibility that I might become someone worth saving. I know that you've used what happened to us to make air travel safer and more dignified for everyone. I know that young people look up to you and that your example has changed how people treat each other. I'm glad something good came from something so ugly. When I'm released next year, I will never fly again. Not because I'm banned, though I am, but because I need to stay grounded in every sense of the word. I need to rebuild myself from the ground up, starting with basic human respect for others. Thank you for showing me what grace looks like even when I didn't deserve it. Isabella Hartwell. Though I'm thinking of going back to my maiden name. Cameron read the letter twice, then set it aside and stared out his office window at the traffic moving along the Potomac River. He thought about grace and gravity, about second chances and the weight of choices. That evening, he sat down at his computer and composed a brief reply. Isabella, thank you for your letter. Acknowledgement of harm is the first step toward healing both for those who cause it and those who suffer it. The fact that you wrote those words tells me that the person you're becoming is someone worth knowing. I wish you well on your journey. Cameron. He sealed the letter and put it in the mail the next morning. 6 months later, Isabella Hartwell was released from federal prison. She walked out of the facility in donated clothes, carrying a single bag containing letters from Maria Santos, a few books, and the notebooks in which she had written reflections on her time inside. She took a Greyhound bus to a small town in Vermont where Maria's sister had offered her a job cleaning rooms at a modest hotel. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work, and Isabella had learned to value honesty above glamour. She rented a small apartment above a bakery, furnished it with thrift store finds, and settled into a rhythm of work reading and quiet reflection. She volunteered at a local literacy program teaching adults to read, many of them immigrants whose first language wasn't English. Working with these students, Isabella began to understand something she had never grasped during her privileged youth. Dignity wasn't something you wore or bought or inherited. It was something you practiced every day in how you treated others and how you treated yourself. She followed Cameron's career from a distance, reading about his continued work to transform aviation safety and equity. She never contacted him again, understanding that her gratitude was best expressed not in words, but in actions, in becoming someone who added to the world's store of kindness rather than its catalog of cruelty. On the second anniversary of Flight 847, Cameron was invited to give the keynote address at the International Aviation Safety Conference in Montreal. His speech was titled, Grace Under Pressure Lessons from 35,000 Feet. 2 years ago, he told the audience of pilots, engineers, and aviation officials, I boarded a routine flight from New York to London. I was tired, looking forward to sleep, and dressed like any off-duty professional, which is to say comfortably and without concern for impressions. A fellow passenger looked at me and decided based entirely on my appearance that I didn't belong in first class. She was wrong about that, but she was even more wrong about something else. She assumed that her discomfort with my presence was more important than basic human courtesy. What followed was a masterclass in how quickly civility can collapse when people choose assumptions over respect. But it was also a demonstration of something more powerful, that crisis reveals character, and character ultimately determines not just who we are, but who we become. That flight taught me that grace isn't the absence of pressure, it's choosing dignity despite pressure. It's helping someone with their seatbelt even after they've called you a criminal. It's refusing to let someone else's hatred change your heart. We've spent the last 2 years transforming how the aviation industry handles passenger conflicts and crew training. We've implemented new protocols, updated policies, and created systems designed to prevent discrimination and promote dignity. But the most important changes can't be mandated by regulation or enforced by procedure. The most important changes happen in individual moments when each of us chooses to treat another person as worthy of respect, regardless of how they look, how they dress, or whether they seem to belong in our space. At 35,000 feet, we're all just people, sharing the same sky, breathing the same air, hoping to reach our destination safely. When we remember that simple truth, everything else becomes possible. Thank you. The audience rose in sustained applause, but Cameron was already thinking about his next flight home. Grateful for the simple privilege of traveling in a world where dignity was becoming one conversation at a time, the standard rather than the exception. In her small Vermont apartment, Isabella heard excerpts from the speech on the evening news. She turned off the television and sat in the quiet, thinking about grace and gravity, about the weight of choices and the possibility of redemption. Outside her window, airplanes traced contrails across the evening sky, carrying passengers who might never know how a single flight over the Atlantic had changed the world below. Dr. Cameron Blake never set out to become a symbol or to change an industry. He simply chose, in a moment of crisis, to remain true to his principles. He helped someone who had attacked him, not because she deserved it, but because he did. Isabella Hartwell learned too late to save her marriage or her fortune that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn by giving it freely to others. Their story reminds us that at 35,000 feet or at ground level, we're all just people sharing the same journey. How we treat each other along the way is the truest measure of who we are. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it's also the measure of who we can become.